everyone, and welcome to Making Meetings Work. My name is Mary Klein. I'll be your facilitator today, and I am super excited to be here with you all to talk about a subject that is definitely near and dear to my heart. I feel kind of passionately about using time effectively and efficiently, and that certainly applies to meetings as well. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, making meetings work for you, making sure that meetings are both effective and efficient. So a couple of housekeeping items. I am going to be using the chat function from time to time. I'll be throwing out some questions and looking for some responses. So I encourage you to participate in that. And then also I have my trusty colleague Audrey here helping me. And she's also available on chat if you're having any technical issues or questions for Audrey. She'll make sure to reply to those right away as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's start with some funny, shocking, and interesting stats on meetings. As I'm going through these, I want you to think about how they impact you, what your experience has been around these. So first one, 37% of employee time is spent in meetings. So think about how much time you're spending in meetings. Managers are even worse. Managers, anyone in a management role or a supervisory role, are attending more than 60 meetings per month. That's a lot of meetings. Over 70% of meeting attendees brought other work to meetings. So again, think about yourself. Have you ever been guilty of that? Have you ever been leading a meeting where others have brought work with them? It is estimated that 25 to 50% of meeting time is wasted. And frankly, when I read that, I thought that number was a little low. And the interesting thing about statistics on meetings is they're kind of hard to nail down. So if you do any research, you'll see some different stats on meetings. And one other stat that I saw showed that 60% of meeting attendees actually thought their meetings were valuable. So it's just kind of interesting to look at those different numbers. But again, think about the meetings that you're attending in a typical week and how much of that meeting time you feel could have been used in a more productive way. And then lastly, kind of a staggering stat at the bottom, there are 36 million meetings that happen every day in the United States. And you may be feeling like there are 36 million meetings happening just at your organization on a given day. Because I know so many of us feel kind of meeting to death, that it's just meeting after meeting after meeting. So just some interesting statistics to get us going. So, have you ever felt like this in a meeting? The meeting leader seems a little oblivious to the fact that some of his participants are falling asleep, maybe they're on their phones, checking their email, kind of dozing, lots of things going on here. So what I'd like to see in the chat room, I'll ask a question and then if you can just respond via chat. What are the most frustrating or most common kind of bad behaviors or frustrations that you're experiencing in meetings? So what's kind of driving, specifically, what's kind of driving you crazy about meetings? Okay, so I love it when multiple attendees are typing is what my chat box is telling. Okay, great. So yes, people talking over each other. Got a couple people talking about that. Too many meetings. Oh, those side conversations kind of drive me crazy as well. Lots of multitasking going on. Overall poor communication. That not staying on task and being distracted, going off on tangents. People going over meeting time parameters. Yeah, so all of those things are frustrations that can be solved through effective meeting management. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Basically, how to overcome all of those topics, all of those frustrations that you just listed in the chat box. So we've broken this down into 3 components of effective meetings. The first one is having a good structure to your meeting, and we're going to drill down on that one. Having relevant content, so making sure you're talking about the right things, and then having strong leadership and facilitation. So in our short 30 minutes together today, we're going to focus on the top one and the bottom one, good structure and strong leadership and facilitation. That's how we'll spend our time today. So let's talk about good structure first. So the very first question that's important to ask is a meeting necessary? I think for many of us, it's kind of our knee-jerk reaction. We've got a problem, we've got an issue, let's have a meeting. So asking that question of, is a meeting necessary, is very important. Why do we have meetings? Well, some people feel like the reasons we have meetings are the following. Are you lonely? Tired of working on your own? Do you hate making decisions? Why not hold a meeting? You can see people, show charts, feel important, point with a stick. Everyone loves to point with a stick, and eat donuts, another popular one. Impress your colleagues, all on company time. Meetings, the practical alternative to work. So if that's the reason meetings are happening in your organization, probably much better ways to handle the issues than holding a meeting. So again, why do we have meetings? Well, there are a lot of valid reasons out there to have meetings. So just to name a few, we can have meetings to solve problems, to make decisions, to gather or share information, to hear a presentation, to brainstorm ideas. And there are many other valid reasons to have meetings. But in asking yourself the question, is a meeting necessary, you open your mind up to some other alternatives. So in the chat box, if you could give me some ideas on what are alternatives to having meetings. So if you ask yourself the question, should I gather a group of people to address this, or are there other alternatives out there to me? What might be some other alternatives? Yeah, so conference calls. And conference calls is an interesting one because some of the rules that apply to meetings also apply to conference calls, but sometimes those conference calls are much quicker. I love polling and SurveyMonkey. I think that's an excellent alternative to having meetings, or doing a chat room. Sometimes just sending an email is enough. If it's just to disseminate information, I don't know about you all, but I know I've been in meetings at times where I thought, why wasn't this information just sent to me? There really wasn't much discussion. It was just a dissemination. And although sometimes appropriate, especially if it's on an emotional issue, oftentimes that can be handled in email. Yeah, phone conversations. I always say that we've kind of lost the art of the one-on-one. Or we've lost the art of just having the casual conversation. We call a meeting a structured meeting instead. And sometimes just having that one-on-one conversation is more productive, more effective, more efficient, even if you have to have that one-on-one conversation with several people. So really, I think you all have covered everything that I suggested and then some. Yammer Group is another good example. So we covered one-on-ones, emails, surveys. When I said hallway conversation, I really was just talking about those casual, running into someone in the hall and just having a 5-minute quick conversation. Can be handled over a phone conversation as well. So first question you ask yourself, is a meeting really necessary? And if the answer is no, then you think about your alternatives. If the answer is yes, then you've just kind of signed up to devote some time to organizing, planning, and structuring your meeting. So let's talk about that. So if you have decided that your best alternative is to have a meeting, then there are 3 things that are important to do. First of all, prepare before the meeting. So, spending that time, committing to spending some time preparing. Leading and facilitating during the meeting. And of course, managing accountability after the meeting. So we're going to, again, drill down into these topics to discuss each one of them. So first thing, planning before. Some people think, okay, I've sent the email invite, or I've sent the meeting invite out. People have responded. I'm just going to wing it. They won't know. It'll work out. Chances are good that people are going to know if you're winging it. I highly encourage you to spend some time up front prior to the meeting doing some planning. And when we talk about planning, we're going to talk about 5 steps, and we're going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. So defining your meeting purpose and objective, determining the type of meeting, asking who should attend, building an agenda, and assigning roles. So let's talk first about defining your meeting purpose and objective. So your meeting purpose and objective really answers the question, why meet? So you've already gone through the mental exercise of asking yourself, is a meeting necessary? And the answers to that question really also answers the question, why meet? I think that if you can't clarify and articulate why you're gathering a group together, you really don't have the right to gather them and to use their time. So answering the question of why meet and putting that into writing and clarifying that, so very important. What it does for you is several things. First of all, it creates that common expectation. So I get the meeting invitation, and sometimes it's just an invitation with maybe a name for the meeting, maybe a topic, but oftentimes it's unclear what will be discussed at that meeting. So when you're creating that common expectation and you're communicating your meeting objective, it lets people know what to expect. It creates that expectation. It also answers the question, am I the right person to be attending this meeting? Because how many of you have accepted a meeting request, gone to the meeting and realized, Susie on my team probably would have been the better person to attend this meeting. Had I really known more about it, I could have figured that out. The other thing it does for you, and this is kind of overlapping into facilitation, is as someone who facilitates and leads meetings, to be honest with you, I'm always looking for crutches. So for me, the meeting purpose and the meeting objective is a crutch that I can use during the meeting to help keep the meeting focused. Oftentimes, I'll even write it up on one of those big Post-it note flip charts and stick it on the wall. Even for an hour meeting, it takes a minute to write down the objective, stick it on a poster, write it on a whiteboard, and really use it as a crutch to keep the meeting focused. When people want to go off on tangents, you can bring them back and say, okay, now today's meeting, remember today's meeting is about this, and bring them back to that meeting purpose and that meeting objective. When you know what you want to accomplish, it's much easier to get there. If you go into a meeting without that focus, it's very easy to get distracted. So I have a quote up on your screen by Yogi Berra, and some of you may not know who Yogi Berra is or was. He was a baseball manager in the 50s and 60s, so quite a few years ago. But he's got all these great crazy quotes, and if you're a quote person, you might want to go look at some Yogi Berra quotes because most of them are very humorous. So Yogi says, if you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else. So true in meetings. Again, how often have you been in a meeting where you've intended to go in one direction and an hour passes and you look at your watch and you think, how did we get to where we are right now? So meeting purpose and objective, it takes a very short time to formulate. Keep it short and sweet. We're not talking about a paragraph explanation. We're talking about a sentence or two, just to really let people know the purpose of the meeting, the objective of the meeting. If you want to take it a step farther, you can even also create more specific meeting objectives, more specific expectations for each item on your agenda list. So the meeting objective or purpose is kind of for the overall meeting, but you can take it a step farther and create meeting expectations for each agenda item as well. All right, so next step is to determine the type of meeting you are having. And again, to articulate that to your meeting participants. Because people come in with a certain mindset. If I'm going to a brainstorming meeting, I'm going to come into the meeting with a very different mindset than if I'm going in with a decision-making meeting. So letting people know up front that, okay, the expectation, this can be part of your meeting objective, is that we're going to be making decisions today. So come prepared with any data, information you need to actually make the decisions. Versus a planning meeting. And I know sometimes we're in planning meetings for planning meetings. So we need to plan a meeting. We need to plan a project. So we're in that planning mode. Again, different mindset. Staff meeting is on this list. So what's interesting to me about staff meetings is oftentimes, a staff meeting is a staff meeting, but really a staff meeting should be categorized a little more specifically. So are we problem solving? Are we simply updating? Are we team building? What is the staff meeting all about? So taking it a step farther from a staff meeting and really articulating what type of meeting it is beyond that. The other tip here is to be aware of the regularly scheduled meeting. So many of us have meetings on our calendar. Hey, it's 2 o'clock on Thursday, it's time to meet. And when we get into that pattern, it's just important to ask ourselves, is that meeting really necessary? I'm not a big proponent of canceling meetings, but sometimes it's more effective to cancel a meeting than to have a meeting that's going to be inefficient. So, if it's 2 o'clock on Thursday and you realize that there are no decisions to make this week, there are no real issues that we haven't already discussed, maybe in one-on-one meetings or in other venues, we don't have a lot of substance for our weekly meeting, let's go ahead and cancel it today. And I think most people are very appreciative of that because they've just gotten an hour back of productive time on their schedule. So think through the type of meeting, communicate that to your folks so that they know what to expect. All right, the other age-old question, who should attend my meetings? And I think meeting attendance, meeting participation is a critical success factor to having effective meetings. Getting the right people in the room, critically important. So let's kind of think about and maybe broaden our perspective on who should attend meetings. So think about people who have expertise. Those people who have expertise in your subject matter are going to lend credibility to that discussion. Those key decision makers, who needs to be present to really understand the issues, who are going to be making the decisions. Another group to think about are those people affected by the decision, because they're going to come with a different perspective than those key decision makers perhaps. I'm also, depending on the topic, I'm a big advocate of getting diversity of thought. So when we think about diversity of thought, we can think about diagonal representation, meaning people at different levels of the organization, people from different areas in the organization, people who represent different interests of the organization. We can also think about someone who very specifically is going to play the devil's advocate. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment when we talk about facilitating meetings, but you want someone there who's a bit of a naysayer. And if you don't have someone who's naturally a devil's advocate, you can certainly assign that as kind of a role for someone to play. So, Joe, today I want you to play the role of devil's advocate and really question us on what we're discussing. I also think it's a good idea to sometimes invite someone new to the meeting or to the project team to say, we need a new, fresh perspective, someone who hasn't experienced all the history, someone who's going to bring some new ideas. So I think that's a thought as well. The other thing to consider when you're thinking about meeting attendance is the size of the meeting. So having, 3 to 7 people, I think is a good number. It's very manageable. That's still a relatively small group, especially on that low end. So your diversity of ideas may be a little limited. 8 to 12 is a great group size. At that point, you're probably getting a fair amount of diversity and a wealth of ideas. A little more complex to facilitate and manage, but usually worth it. When you're getting up to 15 plus people in a room, that becomes more challenging to facilitate. And actually, sometimes the conversation is not quite as rich, or you're only hearing from a small subset of the people in the room. So thinking about meeting size is another factor you want to consider. It was interesting. I recently watched a TED Talk by, I'm forgetting his name, Dave Grady. It was called How to Save the World, or at least Yourself, from Bad Meetings. And it was a really interesting TED Talk. It was maybe 7 minutes long. And one thing that Dave talked about was this worldwide epidemic, he called it, of MASS. What does MASS stand for? Mindless Accept Syndrome. Meaning you get invited to a meeting and you just accept it. I'm invited, I'm important, I'm accepting. And without really thinking about, am I the best person? Do I have knowledge? Why are they inviting me? So I'd recommend watching the TED Talk. Like I said, it's about 7 minutes long. It's amusing and has some good information in it. But that really resonated with me, that mindless accept syndrome, MASS. So then his kind of, I'll ruin it for you a little bit at the end, he says, no MASS, right? No mindless accept syndrome. Really ask for information, ask for meeting purpose, ask even for agenda, we'll talk about in a moment, before accepting your meeting requests. Okay, next step, building an agenda. So building an agenda is so important. And again, I think a lot of people tend to think about winging it. And I really recommend spending the time to build an agenda. And my tip is always, whatever you're doing now, kick it up a level. So some things to think about in building an agenda. Sorry. First of all, and this one can be a little controversial, contain as few topics as possible. So I think many of us tend to be a little over anxious or a little think we're going to be more productive than we're going to be, and we put a ton of agenda items on our agenda, and then we only cover a third of them, or we only cover half of them. And that's frustrating to meeting attendees. So really push yourself and think, okay, of these agenda items, which ones are most important? So I say take a first pass, list your agenda topics, and then go through that list again and edit a little. Take away a couple topics to make sure that you're going to be able to be realistic in what you're going to accomplish. Then sequence strategically, meaning there are really two ways to think about this. One is I want to do some quick wins. I want to have some momentum at the beginning. So I'm going to put some shorter, kind of easier topics right at the top of the meeting so we can get those, get them checked off, get some momentum, and then build on that momentum. The second strategy is kind of most important to least important. So, we have a limited time. I want to make sure that we're getting through things that are the most important. But really be strategic about how you sequence your meeting topics. And then decide on time blocks. And to be honest with you all, I struggle with that. To this day, and I've been doing this for many years, I still struggle on time blocks. But that doesn't mean I don't do it. I take my best shot, and I use those as a facilitator to guide my decision making in terms of, do we move on, or do we stay where we are? Do we hurry things up? Do we put some agenda items on for future agendas? So really thinking through that time blocks is important in terms of facilitation. Involve your participants. Ask them for agenda items. When they're more bought in and involved, they're more likely to be engaged during the meeting. And then lastly, communicate that agenda ahead of time. This is where I'm saying, whatever you're doing now, try to kick it up a notch. So maybe you're doing agendas, but you're not sharing that ahead of time. If that's the case, try to share them ahead of time. If you're not doing agendas at all, next meeting you have, later today, tomorrow, next week, take a stab at making an agenda. Also think about pre-work. Does pre-work make sense? Are there things that they could be doing ahead of time that are going to help our meeting run more efficiently and effectively? Things to read, reports to review. Two caveats, just check yourself and make sure you're giving them enough time to complete the pre-work. And then when they attend the meeting, make sure that you are holding them accountable for doing that pre-work. Okay, so that is all the preparation and lots of it. But when you get good at this, you can spend, again, depending on the complexity, depending on the length of the meeting. If you're holding a 1-hour meeting, it could take you 10 minutes to do the planning. And that's 10 minutes very well spent, because you're going to get that time back in the meeting by being able to be more focused and have people more engaged. So now let's talk about leadership during the meeting, our next topic. So leadership and facilitation. When you lead a meeting, it's like being a leader in any other aspect. There are certain responsibilities that are included: providing structure, encouraging participation, being decisive, and holding participants accountable. So when we're talking about providing structure, that's everything you've already done. That's what we were just talking about. All those things leading up to the meeting are going to help you provide structure during the meeting. Encouraging participation, making sure that you're getting everyone involved. Being decisive, so again, knowing when you need to hurry things along, knowing when it's more important to let the conversation flow, and always being mindful of your time frames. And then holding participants accountable, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So some more facilitation tips. First of all, keeping the group focused. I think many of you in the chat at the beginning of the session talked about those tangents and one person dominating and all sorts of other things that happen during meetings that cause the meetings to be unfocused. So a couple of things you can do. First of all, just for some facilitation tips, just being very mindful and aware. Setting up some ground rules at the beginning of the meeting. I'm a big fan of ground rules. I usually do 2 or 3. If you do a lot of ground rules, they kind of lose their punch, lose their effectiveness. But just, no tangents. Today we're completely being focused on our agenda items. And then really utilizing a parking lot. With the parking lot, when someone brings up a tangent, oftentimes those tangents are important items to be discussed. We just don't have time to discuss them right now. So putting that up on a parking lot and then always making sure to follow up on those parking lot items, because you don't want them to be the land of misplaced toys, right, where nothing ever happens with them or people will no longer trust the parking lot. Making sure you're maintaining safety as a facilitator. So of course we're talking about emotional safety, where you're building on people's ideas, not putting ideas down, where you're inviting quiet members or reticent members to participate. Getting the group unstuck, being aware when you're talking in circles and making a commitment to move the group forward. And then, of course, managing difficult participants. So this was kind of an interesting statistic. Meeting engagement is a function of who is talking. When the presenter is doing most of the talking, about 78% of meeting participants are engaged. That means you're losing about a quarter of your participation. If you've only got a group of 4, that means you're losing 1 person. However, when it's a dialogue, when all members are engaged, then 92% are focused and engaged on the meeting topic. So really important to spread the wealth. Important to mind for conflict. So minding for conflict is that we want people to disagree. We want people to have some good conversation, or else why are we having a meeting? If we're just putting it out there and doing all the talking, not an efficient use of time. So doing things like asking open-ended questions, reinforcing positive contributions, asking for concrete examples, all very important. And then lastly, create closure. If you've had a great meeting and had a lot of great discussion, that's fabulous. But unless you're going to hold people accountable and drive things forward, then it has not been efficient. So make sure you're summarizing what's been accomplished. You're comparing that to your desired outcomes, to your meeting objectives. Identify any unfinished agenda items so that you can put this to a future meeting, and then drive accountability. Who is responsible for what by when? And that includes doing some follow-up on your part as a leader to make sure people are following through on what they've committed to. So we have covered structure, and we've covered briefly strong leadership and facilitation. And relevant content is kind of the outcome of those things. When you've got a good structure, you've got good leadership and facilitation, your result is going to be an efficient, effective meeting that delivers the content that you wanted it to. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. I was happy to spend 30 minutes with you. Please know we do offer a course in leading effective meetings. If that's something you're interested in, please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is on the screen. Or if you'd like information on any of our other customer service courses, we'd be happy to talk to you about that as well. Thanks and have a great day.